Sometimes, a memory arrives not with sound, but with light, or a shadow on the wall, or a single cloud moving across the sky. Tonight, you'll join Walter, a widowed Navy veteran living beside a quiet lake in Vermont, as he discovers a truth that Buddhist monks have known for centuries, that our suffering often has less to do with what happens and more to do with what we believe about what happens. So, take a deep breath, exhale slowly, and settle in. Let the stillness hold you. Let the mist roll in. Welcome to Cosmic Zodiac, where we explore the stories that live quietly inside us and the teachings that guide us through them. Stay with us for this quiet unfolding. You might find that what you've been holding on to is ready to be released. And now, we begin. Walter lived alone in a cedar cabin he built himself, perched on the northern shore of Lake Manawa. The lake was narrow but long, surrounded by pines that whispered in the wind like old friends. Some days, deer came to drink at dawn. Other times, loons cried out across the water, their eerie voices echoing off the granite cliffs. Walter had retired from the Navy almost 20 years ago. His wife had passed 5 years before. The kids were grown, scattered across distant cities. He saw them now and then, but mostly, it was just him and the lake. Each evening, after dinner, Walter would row his old wooden canoe out into the water. The creak of the oars, the slap of ripples against the hull. This was his meditation. He didn't call it that. Walter wasn't the type to burn incense or chant mantras, but something about that quiet motion across the lake settled him in a way nothing else could. And on this evening, the lake was particularly still, the sky an open dome of silver. A light mist hovered just above the surface, softening the lines between water and sky. Walter took a breath. The cool air filled his chest. Peace. Silence. He dipped the paddle once more, and the canoe glided forward. That was when he saw it. A dark shape ahead. Emerging through the mist, another canoe, pointed directly at him. He blinked. The other boat wasn't stopping. It was coming straight toward him. Too fast. He sat up, straighter, and called out, "Hey, watch it!" No response. The boat kept coming. Walter's stomach tightened. "I said watch out," he shouted louder, gripping his paddle. The boats were maybe 20 yards apart now. He tried to steer aside, but it was too late. With a dull thud and a scraping crunch, the two hulls collided. Walter's canoe rocked hard. He caught himself with an oar, his heart pounding. Then, fuming, he turned to face the other boat's occupant, ready to give them a piece of his mind. But the other canoe was empty. Nobody was there, just an old green canoe, chipped and cracked, floating free, its tether likely broken somewhere upstream. Walter stared, stunned. His breath still came fast, but something inside him shifted. The heat of his anger drained away, replaced by something else, confusion. Then, a quiet sort of shame. He had been yelling at no one. He had shouted at a ghost, and then he laughed. Just once. A low, soft chuckle, and the mist swallowed it whole. Later, sitting on his porch with a cup of chamomile tea, Walter replayed the scene in his mind. I got so mad, he thought. I felt attacked, but there was no attacker. Just a boat, just adrift, He shook his head and smiled. And then, quite unexpectedly, a sentence came to him, something he'd read years ago in a book his wife kept beside the bed. You will not be punished for your anger. You will be punished by your anger. It had been attributed to the Buddha. At the time, Walter hadn't given it much thought, but now it landed differently. His anger hadn't protected him. It hadn't fixed the problem. All it had done was disturb his peace. He sat a while longer. The mist had thickened now, curled around the porch posts like smoke. How many times, he wondered, have I been shouting at empty canoes? That guy who cut me off in traffic last month. The neighbour who didn't wave back. The clerk who didn't smile. I told myself they were rude. I assumed they meant disrespect. But maybe their boats were just drifting. Maybe they were lost in their own fog. He took a sip of tea. What if that's true of most people? What if it's true of me? Zen Buddhism teaches that much of our suffering comes not from events themselves, but from the stories our egos create around those events. In the story of the empty boat, a traditional Zen koan, a man is enjoying a peaceful row down the river when he is struck by another boat. If there's someone in that boat, he becomes furious. But if it's empty, his anger dissolves. Why? Because we react not just to what happens, but to the perceived intent behind it. Our minds fill in motives where none exist. We assume malice, when perhaps there is only confusion, distraction, or pain. This is the habit of ego, to make everything personal. But Zen invites us to see differently. Zen invites us to ask, what if it isn't about me? What if the boat is empty? Over the following weeks, Walter found himself remembering that moment again and again. Once, a neighbour's dog dug up his garden. The old Walter would have marched over, voice raised, demanding compensation. But now he paused, took a breath. When the neighbour came by to apologise, clearly embarrassed and flustered, Walter just smiled and said, "No worries. Let's call it even for that apple pie your wife gave me last fall." The man blinked, then smiled. "I owe you another one," he said. They shook hands. A week later, a pie showed up on Walter's porch. Empty boat, he thought. Another day, he watched a teenage boy speed his pickup through a yellow light, nearly clipping an old woman in the crosswalk. Walter felt the surge of anger, but something in him caught it. He wondered what's going on in that kid's life. And just then, a line came to mind, something he'd heard once in a Dharma talk. Mindfulness means seeing clearly, not just what's outside, but what's arising within. So he watched his anger, held it gently, the way a grandfather might hold a frightened child. And then, it passed. No explosion, just breath, just stillness. That night, he wrote in his journal something he hadn't done in years. "Today I noticed 3 empty boats, and one angry thought that floated away before it could crash into anything." He closed the book and smiled. Maybe, he thought, this is what meditation really is. Not sitting with eyes closed, but watching your reactions, like you'd watch clouds drift across a still lake, noticing, naming, letting go. One rainy afternoon, his granddaughter Emily came to visit. She was 22, freshly graduated, full of opinions and questions. They sat by the fireplace, sipping cocoa. "Grandpa," she said, "why are you always so calm?" Walter smiled. "Who says I'm calm?" She laughed. "You never yell, never complain. Mum says you used to be kind of grumpy when she was younger. Your mum's got a good memory," he said. "So, what changed?" He looked into the fire. "The canoe hit me," he said. Emily blinked. What he told her the story about the mist, the crash, the empty boat. When he finished, she was quiet a moment. Then she said, "That's really beautiful." Walter shrugged. "It was just a boat, but it taught me something. Like what? That most of the things I get upset about aren't really about me." She nodded slowly. "I should probably remember that when I read the news," she said. He chuckled. "Good luck." They sat quietly for a while. Outside, the rain ticked gently on the roof. The Buddha once said, "Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without." Walter had spent years looking for peace in outer order. A tidy house, a reliable retirement, obedient children, a working thermostat. But those things came and went. Peace, it seemed, came not from arranging the world, but from releasing the demand that it behave. It came from letting boats be boats, letting people be people, letting life be what it is, and watching it drift by with gentle eyes. The last entry in Walter's journal that winter read, "Tonight I watched the moon rise over Lake Manawa. The ice hasn't fully melted, but the loons have returned. One of them called, and the sound echoed back low, mournful, beautiful. I used to think I needed to answer every voice I heard. Now, I just listen. Some boats pass without touching me. Others crash in, but most are empty. And even those that aren't, well, maybe those too are drifting." He closed the journal, set it on the table, blew out the candle, and slept deeply. The mist came again that night, and the lake was still, just as it had always been, just as it would always be. Let the lesson linger. Let the ripples fade. Let your mind rest in the still water, because you too can stop chasing boats. You too can drop the oar. You too can drift in peace. Just breathe. Just be. Just listen. The lake was still, and in that stillness, Walter found clarity. But not all truths come on calm water. Some arrive in the middle of danger. Some come when your heart is pounding, and your next breath feels uncertain. This is the story of Rose, and the moment she found peace, not in safety, but between two very real threats, between two bears. Rose was 76, though most people who met her assumed she was younger. Her voice still had a warm lilt, and her eyes held the sharp glint of someone who'd survived more than one kind of storm. She lived on the edge of a forest preserve in southeastern Alaska, in a one-story cabin nestled among Sitka spruce. Her husband, Gerald's had passed away nearly 15 years ago. Since then, she'd become somewhat of a local legend, the older lady who hiked alone, knew which mushrooms were safe to saute, and carried a walking stick carved from driftwood. She called it her third leg, though her stride was still steady. Every morning, rain or shine. She walked a 2-mile loop along a narrow trail that wound its way up the ridge behind her house. "It's not for exercise," she told her niece once. "It's to remember I'm alive." And on this morning, a cool, late September morning, she set out as usual, thermos in her pack, stick in hand, a soft scarf around her neck. She walked slowly, not from weakness, but from attention. She stopped now and then to notice how the moss clung to bark, or how the light slanted differently through the trees than it had the day before. In her mind, walking the woods wasn't a task. It was a conversation, and the forest was always speaking. But that day, the conversation changed. She was halfway up the ridge, near a bend in the trail that overlooked a steep drop-off, when she heard it. A deep, guttural snort, then a crack of branches. She froze. From the left, through a thicket of alder and fern, came a shape, large, dark, powerful. A bear. It wasn't just passing through. It had seen her. Its eyes locked on hers. Rose's heart thudded once, hard, in her chest. Then instinct took over. She turned and ran, which every park sign says not to do, but instincts are older than instructions. She ran. The bear followed. The trail narrowed, and the ridge dropped sharply. Rose's feet pounded the earth, breath ragged, stick forgotten. She rounded the curve and saw just ahead a hanging vine, thick and sturdy, looping down from a tree at the edge of a bluff. She didn't think. She grabbed the vine and swung herself off the trail, legs flailing over open air. She held on tight, body suspended. Below her another slope, and another bear. A second one, this one younger, pacing the rocks below. She had nowhere to go. One bear above, one below. Nowhere forward, nowhere back. Just the space between, and a vine. For a moment, her body trembled. Her palms burned from gripping the bark-wrapped rope. Her legs dangled. Fear rose in her throat, thick and rising, like smoke from a fire she hadn't meant to start. And then, something unexpected happened. She laughed, a soft, breathless laugh. It escaped her lips before she could catch it. There she was, 76, dangling from a vine above a cliff. 2 bears watching from above and below, and somehow, in the middle of all that, she noticed a strawberry. It was growing out of a crack in the rock wall, just within reach. Small, red, perfectly ripe. Sunlight fell on it, lighting it like a ruby against grey stone. Rose stared, and then, carefully, she reached out with one hand, the other still gripping the vine, and plucked it. She placed it gently in her mouth and bit down. It was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. She closed her eyes, chewed slowly, and smiled. She forgot the bears. She forgot the cliff. She forgot even herself. In that one moment, there was only the strawberry, and it was enough. Keeks Tom. Later, she would find her way out. The bear above wandered off. The one below disappeared into the brush. She climbed, slowly, her legs aching, knees scraped, lips sticky with berry juice. She made it back to her cabin, changed into dry clothes, poured herself a cup of tea, and sat quietly for a long time. But that moment between the bears, that moment of taste, stillness, and surrender stayed with her. And something in her shifted. Not in fear, but in freedom. In Zen Buddhism, there's an old parable nearly identical to this. A man is chased by a tiger. He grabs a vine and swings off a cliff. Below him, another tiger. Then he sees a strawberry growing from the rock. He picks it, eats it, and finds joy. This is not a story about ignoring danger. It's about meeting it fully without letting it consume the entire moment. It's about presence. Zen calls this ichigo ichie, one time, one meeting. Every moment is once in a lifetime. It will never come again in exactly the same way. So we meet it, not by fleeing it, not by resisting it, but by tasting it fully, even when tigers or bears surround us. Rose didn't speak of the bears to many people, not out of shame, but reverence. She told her niece. A year later, when the girl came to visit with questions about grief and anxiety in the chaos of the world, "There are always two bears," Rose said. Her niece blinked. "What one is behind you?" Rose continued. "Your past, the things you did or didn't do, the people you lost, the pain you carry." She paused. "The other is in front of you, your fears, your what-ifs, the worry that gnaws on your quiet." Her niece nodded, slowly. "And in between them," Rose said, "there's a vine, and sometimes, if you're lucky," she smiled, "a strawberry." Buddhism teaches that suffering arises from clinging to the past, to the future, to outcomes we cannot control. We try to run from the past and plan for the future. But in doing so, we miss the only place peace is ever truly possible, right here, right now. This breath, this taste, this silence. We are always suspended between regrets and worries, between memories and projections. But if we can let go not of the vine, but of the thoughts that keep us swinging, we might notice the sweetness growing from the rock. The Buddha said, "Do not dwell in the past. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment." Rose didn't call herself a Buddhist. She didn't sit zazen or chant sutras. But that day, between the two bears, she found what the monks have pointed to for centuries. The strawberry is now, and it is enough. There was one more thing. The following spring, Rose returned to the trail. She had avoided that bend all winter, but something drew her back. Not curiosity, something quieter. Respect. She reached the place. The vine was still there, though a little more frayed. She stepped to the edge and looked down, and there, once again, from the same crack in the rock, a strawberry. Just one. Red. New. Alive. She didn't pick it this time. She just looked, then bowed her head, quietly, and whispered, "Thank you." Then she turned and walked slowly home. The forest was still speaking. And now, Rose knew how to listen, not just with her ears, but with her whole being. And sometimes, in the stillness, she heard the bears again. But now, they didn't bring fear. They brought memory. They brought presence. They reminded her, between what has been and what might be, there is what is. And that is always enough. Let your thoughts settle now. Let your breath slow. Let your own two bears, whatever they are, drift a little farther out of reach. Feel the vine in your hands and ask yourself, what's your strawberry? Taste it, savor it, and rest in the only place peace ever lives, Right here, right now, the forest had gone quiet again. And Rose, having tasted a single strawberry between two bears, had returned to her quiet life altered, but not loud about it. Moments like that don't always need retelling. Some teachings arrive softly, like a shadow stepping across your doorstep. Others, they arrive with impact, like the ache in your back that won't let you sleep, or the quiet voice inside that won't let you rest. That's how Carl's story begins. Not with a bear, but with a pain that wouldn't go away. Carl was 79 and had once been a military surgeon, Navy, like Walter. He didn't talk about the war much, but people said he'd patched men together under mortar fire and performed amputations in rain-soaked tents. That was long ago. Now, he lived in Arizona, alone in a ranch house with a view of the desert that went on forever. He liked it that way. At least, that's what he told himself. But there was a knot in his lower back that had started small and grown persistent, a hot, tightening ache that pulsed more at night, especially when he lay down. He'd been to doctors, physical therapy, painkillers, acupuncture, and though the pain would lessen, it never quite left. It stayed, a companion, an unwelcome one. And something in Carl, something deeper than muscle, began to tighten, too. He found himself snapping at cashiers, avoiding phone calls, flinching when the mail was late or when his neighbor's dog barked too long. It wasn't just the pain anymore. It was the person he was becoming in response to it. One Thursday afternoon, while browsing the library, he came across a flyer, Veterans Meditation Circle Thursdays, 5 p.m. at the community room open to all, especially those carrying what cannot be seen. He almost ignored it, but the words stuck, carrying what cannot be seen. He folded the flyer and put it in his pocket, and that evening, as the sun dipped behind the buttes, Carl walked into the small stucco building that smelled faintly of tea and dust. Inside, there were 5 other men, old, quiet. One nodded, another smiled. A woman named Janet led the group. Calm voice, long braid, sharp eyes. "We begin by breathing," she said. "And noticing what we carry." Carl thought, "I carry pain." He closed his eyes and began to breathe. After the sit, they gathered in a circle. No incense, no chanting, just quiet, and a few words. That night, one man spoke. His name was Roy, Vietnam, like Carl. He said, "I used to think the pain in my leg was the problem, but over time I realized the bigger problem was what I said to myself about the pain." He paused. "I think this shouldn't be happening," or "Why me?" or "I can't live like this," and all of that made it worse. Carl looked at him. Roy continued, "A teacher told me once, pain is the first arrow, but we shoot the second one ourselves." The room was silent. Then Janet nodded. "That's a teaching from the Buddha. The first arrow is the event, the wound, the injury, the illness. The second is the reaction, the story, the judgment, the resistance." Carl felt something stir. He didn't speak. But he returned the next week, and the next, and slowly he began to see. Carl had always prided himself on endurance. He had once sewn up a man's abdomen with mortar shells, falling less than 100 yards away. He'd seen death. He'd smelled blood. He had endured, but endurance was not peace. It was clenching, and clenching, over time, becomes suffering. He remembered, one night, sitting alone in his recliner, heat pad against his back, and the thought arose, I hate this body. He froze. That voice, it wasn't new. It had been whispering for years. He just hadn't noticed it clearly. But now, he did. And that night, instead of turning on the television or pouring a second glass of whiskey, he sat with it. He placed a pillow on the floor, crossed his legs the best he could, closed his eyes, and said, silently, I see you. Zen teaches that the mind, untamed, adds layers of suffering on top of what is. It doesn't stop with this hurts. It adds, this shouldn't hurt. This is unfair. This will never get better. This means I'm weak. And each of those thoughts is a new arrow. The first arrow strikes the body. The second strikes the heart. Again and again. Carl had been shooting second arrows for years. He just didn't realize his hand was on the bow. But now, he began to lower it, one breath at a time. He told Janet, weeks later, the pain's still there. She nodded. It probably will be. Carl laughed. That's not very hopeful. She smiled. Hope isn't always about escape. Sometimes it's about becoming friends with what is. That word friends startled him. Friends with pain, but something about it made sense. He'd never shout at an old friend when they limped. Why should he shout at his own back? He began to move more gently, to get up slower, to rest when his body asked, not as defeat, but as kindness. There was a moment that stayed with him. It came a quiet morning. He had slept poorly, and the pain had flared. He sat outside, watching a small cactus bloom in the gravel yard. A hummingbird flitted near, hovered, and zipped away. And Carl whispered to himself, I hurt, and it's okay. It was the first time he didn't follow that sentence with a protest. He just let it be. And the pain, though still present, didn't grow claws that day. It stayed a quiet companion. One arrow, not two. The Buddha taught to understand suffering is the beginning of peace. Carl began to understand, not through lectures, not through books, but through breath, through listening, through noticing that resistance, subtle and constant, was the rope that pulled the pain tighter. When he dropped the rope, even just for a moment, the pain softened. It didn't disappear, but it changed. It lost its voice. It no longer defined him. It just was. One day, a younger man came to the veterans circle. Iraq, 35. Quiet. He had trouble sitting still, kept clenching his fists during sharing time. He blurted out, I hate how weak I am. My wife doesn't say it, but I know she thinks it. Silence. Then Carl spoke. He said gently, what's hurting you isn't just what happened to you. It's what you're saying to yourself about it. The young man looked up. That's the second arrow. The man blinked. What's the first? Carl smiled. Life fires arrows all the time. He leaned forward. But you don't have to keep pulling them out of your own quiver. When man says main psych keys is puffy moist concerns and digitas. Other data to successful. Spy It doesn't rush, it doesn't explain. It just presents heat, silence, thorns, blossoms. Carl began to feel the desert within him. Fewer storms, more space. He still felt pain, but he no longer built a story around it. He no longer labeled himself broken. He simply breathed and bowed. Not in serenity, but in respect to the life that was his, to the body that still carried him, to the pain that had become, strangely, his teacher. One afternoon, he sat alone on his porch, the sky wide above. He thought, I've spent decades trying to be strong by resisting. Now I see. Strength is in letting be. He wrote those words in his notebook. And then, beneath them, I no longer wish the pain away. I just wish to stop hurting myself over it. And I have, at least today. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long amber shadows over the mesa, Carl stood slowly. His back ached, but his heart didn't. He stepped inside, turned on the kettle, and smiled. The second arrow had fallen, and he would not pick it up again. Let the day settle now. Let your breath find its rhythm. Notice what aches, and then notice how your mind responds. If a second arrow arises, you don't have to fire it. You can just breathe. You can just be. You can let the first arrow teach you, and let the second one go. The bell had rung again, and in the pause between sound and silence, Thomas had found peace in the space of not knowing. But there are other kinds of silence, the kind that speaks not from uncertainty, but from deep clarity. And this is the story of Ella, who taught a young man the power of not picking up what was never hers to hold. Ella was 80 years old. She lived in a small brick house on the east side of town, the kind with a tidy porch and flower pots that changed with the seasons. Every morning, she swept her stoop, fed the sparrows, and folded her newspaper just so. People called her Miss Ella, even folks who were older than her. She had a way of moving through the world that made you want to speak gently. Maybe it was her voice, low and calm, like a cello, or the way she listened with her whole face, like your words mattered, even if they were foolish. She had lived through many eras: segregation, protest marches, motherhood, widowhood, retirement. She taught elementary school for 40 years, and she could still recite Langston Hughes without looking. But she didn't dwell in the past. She didn't even tell many stories about it. She simply lived with quiet dignity, and people noticed, even those who didn't know what they were noticing. One Saturday morning in late summer, Ella stood in line at the farmer's market. She wore a wide sun hat, a cane across her wrist, and carried her cloth shopping bag, hand-stitched with red thread. Behind her, a man in his 20s tapped his foot impatiently, tall, restless, wearing a t-shirt with angry letters across the chest. He muttered something about the line, then louder. Maybe if folks didn't take 10 minutes counting out nickels, we'd all get to eat. A few people turned. Ella glanced at him calmly. He smirked. You people always gotta make everything so slow. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. No one moved. A silence fell over the line. Ella stepped forward, collected her tomatoes from the vendor, and turned to the young man. Her voice was gentle, steady. "Oh, child," she said, "I don't accept that." He blinked. "Excuse me," I said. She repeated, "I don't accept that. It don't belong to me." Steve. So I gave him a soft smile. "Whatever pain you're carrying, I hope you find rest from it." And with that, she turned and walked away, not angry, not shaken, just whole. Later, someone asked her, "How do you stay so calm?" Ella chuckled. "Baby," she said, "I was born in 1945. I've been called worse names before breakfast than most folks here in a year." She sipped her tea. "But I don't carry none of it. Not anymore." She paused. "You ever hear what the Buddha said about gifts?" They hadn't. So she told them. "If someone offers you a gift," she said, "and you do not accept it, to whom does it belong?" They answered, "The giver." She nodded. "That's right. So when someone hands you their anger, their hate, their fear, you don't have to take it." She smiled. "I let folks keep their packages. I got no room on my shelf for poison wrapped in ribbon." That evening, the young man came looking for her. He didn't know why. Something about the way she'd said "I don't accept" that kept echoing in his mind. He found her sitting on her porch, sipping hibiscus tea and reading a worn copy of The Prophet. She looked up as he approached. He stood there, awkward. I wanted to say sorry," he said. She nodded. He waited. She didn't fill the space, just looked at him, like he was already forgiven. He sat down on the steps, eyes low. "I've just been angry about everything." She said nothing. "I lost my job. My girl left. I don't know who I'm supposed to be anymore." She sipped her tea, then spoke softly. "That's heavy." He nodded. "I've been shouting at people who don't deserve it." He looked up. "Don't you want to know why?" She smiled gently. "No, baby. I just want to know who you are when you put all that down." Zen doesn't require explanation. It offers presence. And sometimes the greatest transformation doesn't come from solving the past, but from not carrying it forward. Ella had practiced this for decades, in staff meetings where her voice was ignored, in shops where her dignity was questioned, in hospitals where her pain was minimized, at funerals where no one knew the right thing to say. And in each of those places, she chose not to pick up what wasn't hers. She didn't repress it. She didn't bury it. She just didn't accept it. Not out of pride, but from deep knowing. Knowing that she was more than their projections, that she was not the names others used, that what they handed her, anger, blame, bitterness, was a reflection of their own suffering, and she did not need to mirror it. She could stand like a bell and choose not to ring, unless she chose to. There's a teaching in Buddhism called upekkha. It means equanimity, not indifference, not passivity, but the calm space of mind that sees clearly without being shaken. It's like a tree that stands through storm and stillness, alike. Ella was that tree. And when she did speak, her words carried the stillness of branches that had bent without breaking. A week later, the young man returned. He brought a mason jar of pickled okra and a copy of Siddhartha he'd found at a used bookstore. I read that story you told me, he said. She nodded. Don't accept the gift. He looked at her. I've been trying to stop picking up other people's stuff. She smiled. And your own? He paused. I'm still working on that. She reached over, patted his hand. That's where the peace is hiding. He stayed on her porch for nearly an hour that day, just sitting, not needing to talk, not needing to fix anything, just not picking anything up. And in that space, he rested, maybe for the first time in years. The Buddha taught holding on to anger is like picking up a hot coal. To throw at someone else, you are the one who gets burned. Ella didn't quote that one often, but she lived it. She'd let go of so many hot coals. She barely remembered what it was like to clench her fist. She didn't see that as virtue, just common sense. Life's hard enough, she'd say. Without carrying every spark, someone else drops. One day, she opened her mailbox and found a small envelope with no return address. Inside, a single red ribbon and a note that said, "Thank you for not picking it up." She smiled, hung the ribbon by her door, and went back to her tea. The wind moved through her rose bushes that afternoon, soft and steady. Some leaves fell, some stayed. She did not chase either. She just watched, just breathed, just lived as herself, unafraid, unshaken, unburdened. Let the story settle now. Let your breath slow. Think of something someone handed you this week, a word, a glance, a tone. Now imagine holding it and gently setting it down. It was never yours. You don't have to keep it. You don't have to carry it. You can simply breathe and let it return. The wind passed softly through Ella's garden that evening, brushing over her porch like a quiet hand. She had taught without teaching, not by answering, but by not picking up what was never hers. And far across the country, another elder would learn something similar, not from anger, but from porcelain. This is the story of Harold and a teacup that was already broken. Harold was 77. He lived in a small craftsman home in coastal Oregon, shaded by cedar trees and fog. He'd been a high school literature teacher for nearly 40 years, the kind who could recite Frost or Baldwin by heart, and who once brought a live owl into class during a unit on metaphor. After retirement, he took up pottery. What began as a weekend class at the community center had become a daily practice. He had a wheel in his garage, a kiln in his garden shed, and shelves full of stoneware mugs, uneven bowls, and carefully shaped teacups. I don't sell them, he told visitors. I just let them exist. Some were cracked, some were perfect, but all were made with quiet hands and soft breath. His wife, Anna, had passed away 6 years ago. They used to drink jasmine tea together on the back porch, watching the mist rise off the trees. After she died, Harold kept 2 cups on the table every morning. One for him, one for memory. One Saturday, his granddaughter Lily came to visit. She was 10, curious, full of questions. "Grandpa," she said, pulling at his sleeve. "Can I drink from one of the fancy ones?" Harold chuckled. "You mean the cups I made? Yeah. The pretty ones. The ones that look like waves." He hesitated, then nodded. "Okay. Just be careful. Sweetheart." He selected a blue-green porcelain cup, small, with a lip curved like a petal. It was his favorite. He poured warm tea, sat down across from her. She took a careful sip. "This tastes better than at home," she said. He smiled. "Everything tastes better when you're paying attention." Later that day, Lily was helping carry dishes inside. She moved quickly, eager to impress. Too quickly. Her elbow clipped the edge of the table. The cup slipped, spun, fell, cracked clean across the side. Lily gasped. "I'm so sorry," she said, eyes wide. "I didn't mean to." Harold raised a hand gently. "It's all right, Lily, but that was your special one." He looked down at the pieces on the floor, then back at her. "I know." And he smiled. "Let's clean it up." They swept the pieces carefully. Lily kept apologizing. Harold kept reassuring. When they were done, she looked up. "But aren't you sad?" He paused, then reached for a small notebook near the window. He flipped to a page and handed it to her. On it, in his slow, looping handwriting, was written, "Do you see this cup? I love this cup. I use it every day. But one day it will break. And I know that. And because I know that, every time I use it, I love it more." Lily read it aloud, slowly. "Who said that?" she asked. Harold smiled. "A teacher from long ago, a monk. His name was Ajahn Chah." She blinked. "So, you knew the cup would break?" Harold nodded. "All things break, Lily. Even the things we love most." He paused. "That's what makes them so precious." That night, after she went to bed, Harold sat alone in his pottery shed. The cracked cup lay on a folded towel. He touched its edge. It had been with him for years. Anna had helped him glaze it just weeks before her diagnosis. She'd picked the color. "I want it to look like the ocean," she'd said. Now, the ocean had split. And yet, he did not feel loss. Not like before. He felt something else. Gratitude. Zen teaches impermanence, Annika. That nothing stays. That every form we cling to is already in the process of changing. But this isn't meant to bring despair. It's meant to sharpen our eyes, to invite us to love what we hold not because it lasts, but because it doesn't. The cup was already broken, so Harold had used it with care, had poured tea with reverence, had kissed the rim once, after Anna's birthday, and now, as he looked at its quiet fracture, he felt peace, not because it was unbroken, but because he had loved it fully while it lived. The next day, Lily asked him again, "Will you make another one?" He nodded. "Of course, but won't that one break too?" Harold smiled. "Yes." She frowned. "Then why bother?" He reached for a lump of clay, held it out to her. Want to find out she took it? Pressed her small thumbs into the soft center. "It's squishy. It's potential," he said. And together, they began shaping something new. Over the next few days, they made 3 cups, one glazed green, one brown, one lavender with specks of white. Harold let Lily carve her initials into the bottom. She held it like a treasure. "I'll be careful forever," she promised. Harold chuckled. "And one day, it will break." She looked up. He continued. "And that doesn't make it less. It makes it more." She nodded slowly, as if beginning to understand. On the morning she left, she hugged him tight. "Thank you for letting me break your favorite cup," He smiled. "Thank you for reminding me it was never mine to keep." They waved, and the porch was quiet again. That evening, Harold sat with a new cup, the lavender one, still warm from the kiln. He poured jasmine tea, held it gently, and said, "Aloud, I know you're already broken, and I love you." Then he sipped, and the tea tasted like ocean and memory and light. Let your breath slow now. Feel what you're holding, a moment, a memory, a teacup. Now remember, everything you love is already changing, already fading, already breaking. But that is not a reason to fear. That is the reason to love more deeply, to pour with care, to sip with presence, to bow, even to a cup, especially to a cup. The teacup had broken, and Harold had not looked away. Instead, he'd seen its impermanence and loved it more for that. Now, winter settled in across the plains. In a town wrapped in snow and silence, a man named Henry was about to learn something similar, not through porcelain, but through wool and warmth, and the letting go of something that had once meant everything. Henry was 74. He lived in a small white house on the edge of a Midwestern town, the kind where the roads became rivers of slush in December, and neighbors shoveled each other's driveways without being asked. He had once worked in a hardware store. Now, he mostly watched the weather and fed the birds. He was not unhappy, but he had grown quiet. Since Margaret passed 5 winters ago, he'd kept to himself. She had been the one who chatted with cashiers, who baked cranberry bread for the postman, who waved first. Now Henry wore silence like an old coat, well-fitted, familiar, warm in its own way. But there was one thing he had never put away. A scarf, long, soft, forest green, with a single row of mismatched grey stitches at the end where she'd dropped a stitch and laughed about it for days. Margaret had knit it for him during her final winter. She'd placed it round his neck one morning as he left for a walk and said, "If the wind takes you, at least it'll have to tug hard." He had never worn another scarf since, and he never left the house without it. It was warmth. It was memory. It was what remained. One morning, after a heavy snow, Henry bundled up and headed into town. He needed bread, coffee, birdseed. The sidewalk was icy. The air was sharp. He moved slowly. Halfway to the market, he saw a figure huddled near the bus stop, wrapped in a thin hoodie, jeans soaked through at the knees, fingers tucked under armpits. A boy. 16. Maybe younger. Eyes down, shoulders high. No hat. No gloves. No scarf. Henry paused. The cold bit at his cheeks. The boy shivered. They didn't speak. Henry walked past, then stopped. 10 steps later, he stood still. The wind rose behind him, tugging at his scarf. He turned around, walked back, stood beside the boy, quiet. He hesitated, then slowly unwound the green scarf from his neck. "It's warm," he said. The boy looked up, startled. "I can't. You can?" Henry said softly. He placed it around the boy's shoulders, gently, like tying a memory to a stranger. Then he nodded. and walked on. He felt the wind on his neck now, sharper, exposed, but somehow lighter. He made it to the store, bought his bread, his coffee, his birdseed. Didn't mention the scarf. Didn't need to. When he got home, he made tea, sat by the window, and waited. For what? He didn't know, but the house didn't feel quite as quiet, and neither did he. In Buddhism, there is a practice called dana generosity. Not just giving what is extra, but giving what is dear, freely, without expectation, not as sacrifice, but as release. Like a tree offering fruit, like a flame sharing its warmth, like a scarf, passed from one neck to another, not because one deserves it, but because both are cold, and one remembers what it's like. That night, Henry dreamed of Margaret. She was laughing not at anything, just because she wore no scarf, and neither did he. But they were warm, not because of the air, but because they were side by side. He woke with a softness in his chest. Not grief, not quite. Something else, a loosened knot. The next week, Henry walked to town again, snow heavier this time. He wore a new scarf, one of Margaret's old ones, knitted years before the green. He didn't love it the same way, but it held her still. Outside the coffee shop, someone tapped his arm. It was the boy, wearing the green scarf. Eyes clearer now. He nodded. "Thank you," he said. Henry nodded back. "Stay warm," he said. The boy grinned. "I will." Then he reached into his backpack, pulled out a small square of folded paper. "I drew you something," he said, handed it over, walked away. Henry stood in the falling snow, unfolded the paper. It was a sketch, pencil on thin paper, a bird on a windowsill, scarf in beak. Above it, some warmth is meant to fly. He smiled, folded it again, placed it inside his coat pocket, and walked home slower than usual. When he got back way, he pinned the drawing beside Margaret's teacup and poured 2 mugs of coffee, out of habit, and maybe something more. He placed one by the window, let it steam beside the birdseed tray, then sipped his own. Outside, the sky hung low, but inside, everything seemed touched by light. Zen doesn't demand grand acts. Sometimes, it's just a scarf on a cold day, a moment of softness, a break in the pattern, an offering not from abundance, but from presence. That is dana. That is into being. When we remember we are not separate, that your cold is mine, and your warmth can become ours. Let your thoughts be quiet now. Feel what you carry, what you've wrapped around your heart. Ask gently, is it time to pass it on? Is someone nearby? Cold. You don't have to let go all at once. Just unwind it slowly and see what softens, see what warms, see what flies. Henry had given his scarf to a stranger, not out of surplus, but presence, and in doing so, warmed something deeper than skin. Now, just beyond the first frost of winter, in a quiet house on a quiet street, a woman named Miriam was learning something different. Not about giving, but about letting in. This is her story, of a house with no lock, and the visitors we don't always expect. Miriam was 78. She lived alone, but not lonely, in the same home where she had once raised her son, tended to her late husband's garden, and, years ago, painted the living room walls sky blue, just because, now, the blue had faded, like soft breath across the years, but she kept it that way. It reminds me that everything gentle fades. She once told her niece, and that doesn't make it less beautiful. She had soft grey hair she wore tucked behind her ears, knit sweaters that still smelled faintly of lavender, and a kettle that sang when she wasn't looking. She lived quietly. She read. She folded laundry slowly. She watched light shift through the curtains, and she welcomed few guests, except the ones that arrived uninvited from the inside. On a grey Wednesday morning, Miriam sat at her kitchen table with a bowl of oatmeal and a cup of lukewarm tea. Outside, fog lay low across the lawn, like a tired dog. Inside, something stirred in her chest, a heaviness. It had no name. It wasn't sadness exactly, but it felt close to it. She sighed, reached for her spoon, then stopped. Years ago, she would have distracted herself, cleaned something, called someone, turned on the radio, but now she simply noticed. "Hello," she whispered softly, to the feeling. It didn't answer, but it didn't leave either, so she made it a cup of tea. Rumi once wrote, "This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, joy, meanness, despair, gratitude. Each emotion, a visitor, not to be banished or clung to, but invited in, listened to, fed with warm bread, and then allowed to go." Miriam had read that poem years ago, and it had frightened her. Why would anyone let sorrow in? Why set a place at the table for grief? But life, she learned, sends guests whether we open the door or not, and locking it only makes them knock louder. After breakfast, she moved to the armchair near the window. The fog outside had thickened, and so had the feeling. Still no name, but now accompanied by a memory. Her son, age 12, standing in the hallway, backpack on, tears in his eyes. "I hate this school," he'd said. "No one talks to me." She touched his shoulder, but hadn't known what to say. And now, 50 years later, she remembered the silence and wondered, did I fail him? The ache tightened. She sipped her tea, whispered, "You too." The memory sat beside her, quiet, not blaming, just visiting. In den Heinen sind Papavs von Schabernser Aktides Sorters. Hauptmann has on Shilas ba see sein Achilas war metus washters. That's the Han. But to teach Sati mindfulness, Tabelisa, not as bogus, but as welcoming, as presence. A wide, open awareness that says, yes, you're here, I see you, and sometimes that is enough. Not to fix, not to solve, just to see. Miriam closed her eyes, listened to the breath move in, move out, like fog drifting over fields. She didn't fight the ache. She didn't feed it either. She just held the door open, let it be a guest. Later that day, while folding towels, a new visitor arrived. This one had sharper edges. Irritation. Directed at no one in particular. Maybe the squeaky dryer. Maybe the neighbor's music too early in the morning. Maybe her own knees. She clenched her jaw, nearly muttered something unkind, then paused. She smiled. "You too?" She shook her head, amused. "I suppose you can come in. Too. But don't slam the door." She folded the towel, hung it neatly, and felt the irritation soften, just a little, like a child who'd been acknowledged and no longer needed to shout. Toward evening, a third visitor came. This one was unexpected. Joy. It arrived in the form of a chickadee tapping at her windowsill. Tiny, round, curious. She hadn't seen one in months. She laughed, not loudly, but honestly, and said aloud, "Oh, hello." Joy danced for a while. Not long, but long enough to be remembered. Long enough to remind her the door opens both ways. At bedtime, Miriam turned down her sheets. Felt tired, but not heavy. She thought of her guests, of their arrivals and their quiet exits, and of the space that remained unbroken, unburdened, like a room freshly aired. She smiled, whispered into the dark, "Thank you for coming." Then added, "Thank you for leaving, too," and turned off the light. Zen doesn't tell us to get rid of our emotions. It teaches us to bow to them, to let them sit beside us, sip our tea, watch the fog, and leave when they're ready. Miriam's house had no lock, only an open threshold, and a heart brave enough to keep it that way. Let your breath soften now. Think of what visited you today. Joy, sadness, frustration, wonder, maybe all of them. Imagine opening the door, not to hold them, not to push them, just to greet, to host, to listen, and then to let go. Your house is strong enough, your heart wide enough, and none of it stays. Not forever. Not even sorrow, not even joy. Only you remain, watching, welcoming, home. Miriam had opened the door to every visitor, even the ones she once feared. And when she welcomed them all, they passed through more quickly than they used to. Not rushed, just no longer resisted. Now, on the quiet edge of spring, a man sat by a river, and everything he needed to know was already flowing by. Carl was older now. His walk had slowed, but his eyes had grown steadier. Years ago, he had stood trembling before a hospital bed, his wife's hand small in his own. Back then, he had tried to outrun grief, tried to fix it, tried to solve what could not be solved. But something had changed, not all at once, more like a soft leaf turning in the wind. He had learned, little by little, to stop chasing peace and simply sit where it might arrive. That's how he came to the bench. It wasn't much, just an old wooden bench facing the slow river that wound through the edge of town. No plaque, no name, just weathered wood and a view of water that always changed. Some days, he brought a thermos of tea. Other days, just himself. He didn't bring a book, or a phone, or even a watch. He came to listen, to sit, to breathe, and to remember what didn't need remembering. One morning, as the trees began to bud and the clouds broke open in stripes of gold, Carl was already there, seated, quiet, still. That's when the boy arrived. He couldn't have been more than 17. Hood pulled up, shoulders tight, shoes muddy. He stopped a few feet away. Unsure, Carl didn't speak, just nodded gently toward the far end of the bench. The boy hesitated, then sat, The river moved between them. For several minutes, neither spoke. The boy stared at the water, fidgeted with his sleeve, then finally said, "You always sit here?" Carl nodded. Why? Carl looked out, paused, then replied, "Because the river doesn't mind who I've been." The boy blinked. Carl continued, "It doesn't ask me to be different than I am. It doesn't pull or push. It just goes." The boy said nothing, but he didn't leave. The next day, Carl returned, and so did the boy. They sat, watched a leaf pass, a heron land, a twig spin in place, caught in a current's eddy. No small talk, just breath, just presence, just river. On the third morning, the boy spoke first. I get angry, for no reason. Carl nodded. I yell, break things sometimes. Still, Carl said nothing. I don't want to, the boy whispered. Carl waited, then finally spoke. You ever see how the water swells after rain? The boy nodded, but the river doesn't shout at the rain. Carl said, it just rises, then it settles. The boy frowned. It takes time. Carl nodded. The boy stared down at his hands, then said, almost inaudibly, I think I hurt someone. Carl said nothing. The river moved, not rushing, just carrying. The boy took a long breath. They sat and said no more that day. Zen teaches that words can only point. The truth must be lived, embodied, felt like the sun on your face or the hush of dusk. Carl didn't teach, he didn't correct. He just sat and let the river do the talking. Weeks passed. The boy returned often. Sometimes he cried. Sometimes he cursed. Sometimes he said nothing at all. Carl never interrupted, never instructed. He just nodded, or breathed, or poured tea. One morning, the boy asked, how long will I feel like this? Carl looked out, watched a duck drift by, then said, longer if you fight it, shorter if you sit with it. The boy exhaled, and they watched the duck disappear around the bend. Spring deepened. Birdsong thickened. Carl's hair thinned, and still he came. The bench had become more than a place. It was a space inside him, a place where nothing had to be fixed, just witnessed. On a late April morning, the boy arrived carrying a folded towel. Inside 2 sandwiches, he offered one to Carl. Carl took it. They ate in silence. Then the boy said, I think I'm leaving town. Carl looked over. The boy shrugged. I don't know where yet, but I think it's time. Carl nodded. The boy looked down, then said, I don't want to forget this. Carl smiled. You won't, because you were here for it. The boy nodded slowly, stood. Thank you, he said, for not filling the silence. Carl's eyes softened. Sometimes silence fills us. The boy lingered. Then Taom left, not hurried, just onward. Carl watched him go, then turned back to the river. It was the same, and never the same. He didn't need to know what would happen next. He had already arrived, not at a conclusion, but at the bench, and the bench was enough. Buddha sat beneath a tree. Carl sat beside a river. You can sit wherever you are and let life pass like water, not grasping, not pushing, not naming, just being, just watching, just breathing. Let it all flow. The leaves, the anger, the joy, the years, the stories, all of it, already moving and still. Somehow, you remain. Let your breath settle now. Feel your body where it is, like a bench holding you up. Nothing more is needed. You've already arrived at the river, at the end, at the beginning, and it flows. Still, the light was softer this morning. Ruth noticed that before anything else. The way it filtered through the lace curtain, less gold than usual, pale, like memory. She cradled her cup of tea with both hands and stepped outside. The back porch creaked beneath her bare feet. It always had, ever since she and her husband built the house some 50 years ago. A low, hollow moan of wood, welcoming her once more. She sat slowly on the old cedar rocker, letting her knees settle, and exhaled. Above her, the clouds were moving, thick-bodied, slow drifting. They came from the west like visiting relatives familiar, but not quite the same. Ruth, now 82, had a habit of watching clouds. It wasn't a conscious practice. It was just what her body wanted to do whenever the day didn't require anything else from her. Some clouds, she thought, looked like ideas not yet formed. Some like memories she hadn't lived. And then there were the clouds that reminded her of Miriam. She smiled faintly, then took a sip. The tea was still warm. The screen door opened. Footsteps, light ones. Ruth didn't turn her head. "Hi. Mom?" came the voice behind her. "Miriam," she said softly. Her daughter stepped beside her and leaned on the railing. 45, sensible shoes, hands that no longer wore nail polish. They stood in silence for a moment, one watching the clouds, the other watching her. "Can we sit?" Miriam asked. "We already are," Ruth said. Miriam smiled gently and lowered herself into the empty chair next to her. There was a pause. Then came the reason for the visit. "I've been thinking," Miriam said, "and I really think it's time to sell the house." Just like that. Ruth didn't respond right away. She simply watched a long, narrow cloud stretch itself across the blue. It looked like a bridge to nowhere. "Sell the house?" she repeated, as if tasting the words to see how they sat on the tongue. Miriam pressed on. "You'd have your own room. The grandkids would see you more. No stairs to climb. You wouldn't have to do the garden or fix anything when it breaks. We can bring your books. The hummingbird feeder." Ruth sipped her tea. "Not today," she said. "I'm not asking today," Miriam replied. But soon, the cloud she had been watching had already dissolved. She hadn't even noticed it vanish. That evening, Ruth sat alone in the living room. A photo of her husband sat on the mantel. He'd passed 12 years ago, but in the photo, he was holding a rake and grinning crookedly at the camera, as though he had just said something irreverent. The photo had been taken on this very lawn, with autumn leaves all around him. She leaned back in her chair and let the day settle. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even sad. Just aware, acutely aware, that something was beginning to move under the surface of her life, like a branch dipping into the current. The next morning, Ruth walked the house. She didn't plan to. Her feet just started moving, like they had a route to finish before she could consider anything else. She paused at the fireplace and ran her hand along the stone. There was a small dent where a candlestick had once fallen and chipped the surface. Her husband had meant to fix it, but never did. She'd grown fond of it in the hallway. She placed her hand on the wall just beneath the old height marks, faint pencil lines, where Miriam had stood every birthday from age 5 to 15. In the kitchen, she touched the window latch her husband had installed wrong on purpose, because the crooked ones last longer. Everything in this house had been lived with. Oh, nothing was perfect, but all of it was real. And Ruth realized something: the house wasn't clinging to her. She was clinging to it. That afternoon, she returned to the porch. The clouds were lighter today, thin, wispy, transparent in parts. They drifted without urgency. Ruth took a long breath and remembered something Thich Nhat Hanh had once written: "A cloud never dies. It only becomes something else. Rain, snow, tea in your cup, breath in your lungs." She looked at the steam rising from her teacup. Perhaps the cloud she'd watched yesterday hadn't vanished at all. Perhaps it was here, warming her hands. She whispered, "You never left, did you?" And just then, a hummingbird returned. It landed on the feeder same branch, same stillness. It had migrated away for months, and now it was back, as if no time had passed. Ruth watched its wings blur into invisibility. Then, gently, it lifted and vanished into the trees. The following day, she opened the old cedar chest in her bedroom closet. Inside, soft sweaters, letters from students, cards from her husband, and at the bottom, folded neatly, a drawing on aged construction paper, a blue house, a childlike sun, a smiling cloud above. In the corner, "I love you, Mommy, age 7. She touched the lines with the tip of her finger. They had faded, but not disappeared. Outside, the wind was shifting. Leaves rustled against the side of the house. She could smell soil through the window. Ruth closed the box and sat for a long time. She didn't cry, not because she didn't feel anything, but because the feeling was too complete for tears. It filled the space around her like light fills a room just before the lamp is turned on. That evening, she called Miriam back to the porch. They sat together, the way they used to, quietly, with shared sky. "I was angry at the idea," Ruth said finally. Miriam nodded, expecting that, but not anymore. Miriam looked at her. "I thought I would break." Ruth said, "I thought leaving this house would be like tearing out a piece of myself. But it's not." She motioned to the garden, the chipped bird bath, the swing under the elm. "This place gave me space to love, and to grow things, and to lose things. It helped me become who I am, but it never belonged to me." She turned her face upward. "I thought I was the cloud, but I'm not. I'm the rain. I'm already elsewhere, in the laughter of your daughter, in the way you place your hands on your hips when you're frustrated, in the way your boy builds things from nothing." Miriam didn't speak. The wind chime turned once, gently. Ruth smiled. "Let's sell it." That night, she packed a single box, a small book of poetry, her favorite mug, the scarf he had given her on their 35th anniversary, and a folded note she placed quietly on the kitchen counter. It read, "The cloud didn't stay, but the soil is soft, and the garden remembers." She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. The following morning was clear. No clouds, just soft sun and dry leaves. Ruth sat once more on the porch, alone, with one last warm cup of tea. The feeder was empty, but she knew the hummingbird would return. It always did. She closed her eyes, inhaled the scent of rosemary from the garden, and placed a hand over her heart, not to say goodbye, but to say thank you. The cloud didn't stay, but the rain had already become tomatoes, and rosemary, and memory, and breath, and that was enough. The garden no longer needed Ruth's hands, and the house, having held its stories for a lifetime, would soon hold someone else's. Things, like clouds, do not stay, but what they teach sometimes that lingers. This story begins not in a garden, but in a shed, the kind that smells of iron, sawdust, and yesterday, and the kind of silence that hasn't been broken in a long time. That's where Walter stood, not at the beginning of a project or at the end of one, but in the middle of something he didn't have a name for. Walter was 76. He'd once been an electrician, served in the Navy, retired early, married once, widowed twice, lived alone now, in a small blue house off the old gravel road, with a porch he hadn't sat on in months. His knees were stiff in the morning. His right shoulder crackled when he reached too high. He didn't complain. He just didn't reach. The shed out back belonged to his brother, Franklin, or had. Franklin had passed nearly 3 years ago. Stroke, quiet, unfair. He'd been the kind of man people called when things broke. A creaky gate, a child's wagon, someone's heart, sometimes, and everything he touched, he fixed with his hands. Those hands were gone now, but the tools remained. Walter hadn't opened the shed in over 2 years. It wasn't locked. He just hadn't found the right moment until one morning, something shifted. It wasn't a plan. It was more like a small pull behind the ribs, the kind that said, "Today." He walked out back. The hinges groaned when he opened the door. Dust floated in the morning light like memory refusing to settle. And there it was, the workbench, the rows of tools, the faint smell of oil, Franklin's world, perfectly preserved, perfectly untouched. Walter stepped inside. He didn't do anything for a while, just looked. A clamp still half opened, like someone was coming, right back. A drawer left ajar, a pencil sitting next to a scrap of sandpaper. He sat on the stool his brother had built and exhaled. It felt heavier than he remembered, but maybe that was just his own chest. Later that week, he tried sorting, didn't get far. He wiped some tools with a cloth, opened a few drawers, touched more than he moved. There was an old wooden box behind the vise. Inside 2 tiny wooden animals and a folded note. It said, "Thanks for fixing my train. Mom says I should call you Mr. Franklin, but I think you're a wizard." No signature, just the soft print of a child's imagination. Walter closed the box. His brother had never talked much about what he gave. He just gave. That was his way. 2 days later, someone knocked at the gate. Walter squinted into the sunlight. A boy, skinny, maybe 10, messy hair, eyes that darted and returned like a sparrow. "You got tools?" the boy asked. Walter blinked. "What for my chains busted?" the boy said, pointing to a battered blue bike leaning against the fence. "Can't ride it." Walter looked at the boy, then at the shed. "Come back tomorrow," he said, and turned back towards the house. The boy returned the next day. Same bike, same look. Walter met him at the shed. "All right," he said, "bring it in." The boy's name was Eli. He didn't talk much, just watched, asked questions when something didn't make sense. Walter showed him how to loosen the chain, how to feel for tension, how to listen to metal instead of forcing it. They didn't talk about anything else, just the bike, when it was fixed. Eli nodded once, said thanks, and rode off down the lane. Walter watched the back wheel turn until it disappeared. Something stirred in his chest. The next week, Eli came back, this time with a dented lunchbox. My friend's little brother stepped on it. He said, "It won't close." Walter handed him a pair of pliers. "You do it." Eli looked startled. "But I might mess it up." Walter shrugged. "Then you'll learn something. If you don't try, you'll learn nothing." The boy hesitated, then began. Walter stood nearby, offering only silence. That night, Walter sat on the porch. Hadn't done that in months. He listened to the wind shift through the branches, smelled the cedar from the fence, heard the high-pitched whir of a mosquito, and didn't swat at it. He just sat. And in the quiet, he remembered something his brother once said. Tools aren't meant to be kept. They're meant to be used, like hands, like time. Over the next few weeks, Eli came by often, sometimes with broken things, sometimes with nothing. Just sat on the workbench and asked questions. Walter showed him how to hold a saw steady, how to sand with the grain, not against it, how to test tension by feel, not sight. They didn't talk about life, but something was being built anyway. Not a shelf, not a stool. Something quieter. One Thursday, Eli arrived with a box, inside a toaster. "It sparks when Mom uses it," he said. "Scared her." Walter raised an eyebrow. "And you brought it here?" Eli grinned. "Thought we could fix it." Walter smiled in spite of himself. They opened it slowly, carefully. It wasn't about the fix. It was about learning where heat lives and how to meet it gently. That evening, Walter stayed in the shed after Eli left. Alone. He looked around at the walls, the shelves, the tools his brother had touched. He thought of Dana, the Buddhist idea of giving, not charity, but the act of giving without needing to own the outcome. Franklin had lived that way. He built ramps for old ladies without asking. He fixed radios and never charged. He taught Walter to wire a lamp with calm hands and no commentary. He gave, and now Walter understood something. The shed wasn't a monument. It was a doorway, and it was time to leave it open. The next morning, Walter met Eli at the gate, held out a key. "For the shed," he said. Eli stared. "What, you'll look after it better than I can?" The boy didn't speak, just took the key, put it in his pocket, like it was made of gold. That afternoon, Walter sat inside, cup of tea, quiet hands from the yard. He heard a hammer tap, a drawer open, laughter, maybe Eli's, maybe someone else's, and in that sound, Walter heard something unexpected, continuation. The tools were alive again, being used, being useful, being shared. The sun tilted. Walter leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He didn't feel sad, not even nostalgic, just full, like a field that had been sown and no longer needed tending. The Buddha once taught, "What is given in presence is never lost in absence." Walter didn't know the quote, but he felt it, like a nail finally set straight. Later that week, someone asked him if he missed the shed. He smiled and said, "It's still there. Don't you miss having your tools?" Walter thought for a moment, then said, "I miss my brother more, but I don't think he ever really left. I think he's in everything that gets fixed, even if it breaks again." That night, Walter wrote something on a slip of paper. He didn't keep journals, didn't read self-help books, but this came out of him anyway. Use what you have, give what you can, let it go. It will return in hands you never meet. He folded the paper, tucked it inside the old wooden box next to the crayon drawing and closed it. Eli never found the note. Not right away. But one day, years later, he did. He read it once, then read it again, then added his own line beneath it. "Some things are passed down without ever being owned." He smiled and turned back to the workbench. "You've just walked alongside 15 quiet awakenings. No fireworks. No grand declarations. Just people being present. People letting go. People remembering what never left." A cosmic zodiac. We believe wisdom doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just sits beside you on a bench, or shows up in the form of a shoelace, a scarf, a chipped cup, a forgotten name, a folded note. These stories, they weren't really about clouds or rivers or bowls of tea. They were about you, your breath, your aging hands, your memories that rise like fog and clear again. Zen asks only this: can you stay for what is not fix, not flee, just notice, and in that noticing, awaken. If one story today reminded you of something you once loved, or helped you breathe just a little softer, then it has done its work. And so have you. We'll see you again soon here on Cosmic Zodiac. Until then, Stay soft, stay awake, and stay close to the river. It's always flowing.